It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation, to another exciting episode of your favorite Shakespeare authorship mystery podcast. I have with me for this episode a returning guest. You maybe remember him from our discussion that we had a year or so ago in a previous episode regarding the source material for Romeo and Juliet, the Italian sources for that play. His name is Michael Curtotti, and he is back here again, this time to discuss his work on Cinthio's Desdemona, the source work, the story that inspired Othello. Michael, welcome back to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be back, and thank you so much for allowing me to present this work on your show. It's a great show and it has so many interesting interviews, and I hope what we'll share today will be interesting to your audience.
Well, it's very intriguing to me. And as a matter of fact, I just recently had an episode where I had my friend, actor, director, writer, Ted Lang, who wrote a prequel to Othello, and we were discussing Othello in some detail. And we mentioned, of course, Cinthio's source, and it just turned out to be a perfect coincidence and coming together of serendipity that you reached out to me right about the same time to talk about the work you've done on this source. And one of the things that we pointed out that I know you will also point out is this novella wasn't translated into English until long after Shakespeare's play comes on the scene. So to me, in my mind, the only way that it could have served as a source for Othello is by the author having had his hands on a copy of the Italian novella and have been able to read it in its original Italian, which you are also capable of doing.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, that's absolutely a key issue in terms of how the story goes from its Italian version to the Shakespeare version that we know. I'd almost concluded with 100% certainty that Shakespeare or the writer of Othello must have read it in Italian, but then I've kind of ended up with sort of a qualified conclusion. As usual with these things, with source studies, it ends up being a little bit more complicated than you first think. What is certain is that there must either the author himself, either the playwright himself, work from the Italian version, or is working from someone he knew pretty closely who had translated it into English for him or for his friends. So I think those are the two scenarios that I ended up with. But yeah, and I think, it'll be interesting to explore that as we go.
Many of these Italian novellas of the day, they were translated into French first, weren't they? Many of them.
Yes, and that's the case for Cinthio's Desdemona as well. There was a 1567 version, I think, if I'm right, in French. So for a long time, people thought that, the French translation explains the Shakespeare's access. There is, however, evidence in the Shakespeare text, and it's because the French version tracks the Italian version so closely, you have to get down to the level of individual words. And there's a particular phrase, ocular proof, which occur, and basically Othello's talking to Iago, and he says, Iago's claimed that Desdemona's cheating on him, and Othello says, if you don't give me ocular proof, it's going to be bad for you, that sort of thing. And that phrase, ocular proof, comes pretty much direct from the Italian language, the Italian phrasing, which is not in the French, and is along the lines of se non mi fai vedere con gli occhi, if you don't let me see with my own eyes, in a more literal translation. Mm-hmm. So that's the evidence for the story having come direct from the Italian text.
And so there's where we get the word ocular, right? Is from that Italian word occhi, meaning eye.
Occhi, which means eye in Italian. That's right.
And one of the things I want to remind listeners is that you have a very Italian last name, but you also are a fluent speaker of Italian. And so I want to remind listeners, don't let his Australian accent fool you, folks. Michael is very fluent in Italian. Was Italian your first language, Michael, or is English your first language? And it was, wasn't it?
Yeah. So my family migrated here when I was 2 years of age. And so at home, I would have been learning Italian. I can't remember when I started learning English, but it would have been when I went to school at age 5. So technically speaking, Italian is my first language, although I don't remember that.
Well, we certainly are glad to have you joining us from half a planet away. I mean, you're on the other side of the world, literally, right. And while we're recording this episode. So just want listeners to be aware of that. But also, I want them to be aware of the fact that you are native Italian. You were born in Italy. And then, as you said, you shared with us, your family migrated to Australia.
Thanks, Stephen. You've dropped out a bit there, so I didn't catch all of that.
I was just reiterating what you had already said, actually.
Okay, great.
So what I'd like to know about, though, is we talked before, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, in a previous episode, about Romeo and Juliet and the Italian sources for that. And that was such a enthralling conversation. I was so excited to learn about your research there and what you discovered. And so I kind of want to do the same thing with this book, if possible. So if you could just sort of give us an idea of the process that you go through when you are creating these new translations of these works and doing the cross-referenced study of the source with the ultimate product being Shakespeare's play Othello.
Yeah, sure, Stephen. It's a really wonderful journey to be involved in, and as you mentioned, my first Shakespeare-related novella translation was Romeo and Juliet, and both that one and this one have not only been a translation project. They've been projects about trying to understand the history, the culture, the society around the two works in both places, and to also use that to inform both the translation and also the commentary that I ended up writing. So for this particular book, Cinthio's Desdemona, the story that inspired Othello, most of it ends up being commentary because there's so much interesting things to be said about this story, which pops up in Italy, and then we get a different version of, in Renaissance Italy, and then we get a different version of it in Elizabethan England. And just comparing the two and understanding where they're different, teasing all that out is part of the fun of it all. Though I have to say, Othello, the word fun and Othello really don't fit together. It's quite a distressing story, of course. And although, it's portraying human realities, so I ended up exploring those aspects of Othello.
Well, my wife and I were in Italy almost 2 years ago now, and while we were in Rome, we happened to see that they were doing Shakespeare in the Park in Rome, and they were performing Othello. And so we purchased tickets, and one of the evenings that we spent in Rome, we sat in the park and watched a production of Othello presented by Italian actors, all in Italian. I don't speak Italian, but I didn't need to speak Italian to know the story, obviously, and to understand every moment of the play as it was presented, because the actors were just so good. They were so talented, and they were so full of the passion of this story. And by the end of the play, we were both in tears. When the final curtain wasn't really a curtain, but the metaphorical curtain, when the final curtain fell, as it were, we leapt to our feet in standing ovation along with most of the rest of the audience. It was just so beautifully presented, and it sounded so perfect in Italian, as though it should have been written in Italian. And then, of course, when you look at the source material that was written in Italian, you go, well, duh, doesn't that make sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's what a wonderful experience to have had. And it's just, something mysterious about these stories, how they cross back and forth across cultural barriers. So, you're describing Italians performing the English version in Italian translation, and the opposite was happening in Shakespeare's time. Yeah, it's one of the things that attracted me to writing about these novellas. The fact that these stories do travel across time and culture.
In Cinthio's version, though, and it is really about her, isn't it? It surrounds Desdemona. She's more of a prevalent character and more of the focus of the original story, isn't she?
Absolutely, that's right. And I think it's one of the really interesting differences to bring out between the two versions. So, and that's why I decided to call the translation that I produced Cinthio's Desdemona. In Cinthio's version of the novella, there's only one named character. There's only one character with a name. Every other character has a title or a job position, like ensign for Iago, or captain of the squadron for Cassio, or more for Othello. But Desdemona is given her own name, and I'm sure you know that Desdemona means ill-omened. And so that's the first thing that kind of, gives you a hint that maybe Desdemona is more central in this story than Shakespeare. But there are other key differences that really make the story about her and Iago, although, a lot of the plot is the same. But so in the Shakespeare version that we know, Iago hates Othello. He says that several times in the play. It's his motivation for everything he does. And, there's a complicated narrative of why he hates Othello, but, that's going to be the driving force of the novella, of the play. In the novella, Iago starts by hating Desdemona. The reason he hates Desdemona is because she hasn't even noticed him. He desires Desdemona, and when he fails in attracting her attention, he develops a deep hatred of her. He also hates Cassio because he thinks Desdemona is interested in Cassio, which isn't true. But and because of that hatred, Iago begins to plot how he's going to go about destroying Desdemona. And Othello is the tool he uses to destroy her. So you can see how, for those who know the play, I'm sure most of your listeners do, it's such a profound difference in the plot that it means Iago is a different kind of character. If we were to think of, a label for Cinthio's Iago in a 21st century context, we might think of an incel, someone who is denied sex, although Iago has his own wife. Mm-hmm. Which is quite different to the kind of image we might take from Shakespeare's Iago.
That's a really good point, especially because motivation is such a big question about Iago in the Shakespeare play. And in fact, the writer has him explaining multiple reasons why he hates the Moor, why he hates Cassio, why he's about to do what he's about to do. And the whole context of him resenting Cassio for having been promoted over him is a huge aspect of the play. He even talks about Cassio as being, a Florentine, a mathematician. He's basically a college boy officer, right? Not an actual war veteran type of soldier the way Iago is. And he even then also says that he suspects that Othello has slept with his wife, which is a total different change from what Cinthio's version is, which is basically the jilted lover, right? The scorned man who has been rejected. And so he wants to destroy the object of his desire. If he can't have her, no one else can, right?
Yes, exactly. And those other changes that you mentioned at the beginning, the kind of the martial context. There's also the trial, the meeting at the Duke's palace, all in Shakespeare's first and second acts. None of that is present in Cinthio. When you begin Cinthio's story, what you're hearing about is how much Othello and Desdemona love each other. So much so that they can't even bear to be parted from each other. They never say a cross word to each other. And she insists, and Desdemona insists, that she has to go to Cyprus with Othello because of their bond. The way Shakespeare starts the story, of course, is incredibly different. Starts with Iago, starts with attacks on Othello, and a lot of racial epithets right from the beginning.
So would you call this a play? Would you say that Cinthio's intent was that his novella address racism the same way that we would look at Othello and see Iago as having, it's not just Iago who has these, racist undertones, but even Desdemona's father, right? Brabantio, right? And even to some degree, some of the other members of state, right? Some of the other councils of the Duke. Later on in the play, even Lodovico makes a comment, a little sort of an off comment about, what can you expect from, this barbaric Moor type of a thing. Would you say that's a prevalent theme of Cinthio's original story?
Not in the same way. It's present. You get Iago using racist or racialized language to torment Othello. Usually Iago saying something, though sometimes Desdemona. But it's kind of like a very minor theme of the novella. The major theme of the novella is, this innocent woman, being dragged to her death. And, we're watching the malevolence play out. So it's much more about the gender issues. And it's perhaps interesting to talk about, the context of the novella to explain that a little bit more. So the novella is one of about 112, I think, in a collection published by Cinthio, who's also known as Giovanni Battista Giraldi. Cinthio's his pen name. He published this collection, which is called the Hekatomythi, Greek. I don't know Greek, so my pronunciation's terrible. It works as a frame story, like the Decameron or Canterbury Tales or 1001 Nights. And they're in cycles of 10 stories. And the particular cycle in which the Othello or the Desdemona story appears is in a cycle of 10 stories about infidelity in marriage. And when that cycle ends, there's a discussion between the stories in the frame character. So there's men and women. They're on a refugee ship. They've fled Rome. was sacked in 1527. So, to pass the time, they tell each other stories. At the end of the cycle of 10 stories, where Cinthio lands is a conversation between the men and women on whether women are mistreated by society or whether they deserve what they get. And Cinthio puts in the mouth of the women there in that conversation basically a challenge to male hypocrisy. And it's kind of along these lines. Actually, I can probably quote it for you if you give me a sec. So this is what the woman is saying. It would be better if you men refrained from soliciting and tempting women to ill. For if you did not in your lustfulness trouble them, little would you see of what you term infidelity. But you have wanted to make everything permissible to you and have put yourselves beyond the law, which is no less made for us than for you, for the same sin or to have the same penalty. So basically, saying it's unjust that, men are often praised for their dalliances, whereas women can end up like poor Desdemona.
Right. Well, and, there's so many cultures throughout history where that has been true, right? Men are allowed to go and philander. They're considered conquerors. It adds to their prowess, their reputations with other men. But a woman, if she's promiscuous, she's a whore, she's a slut, she's, a fallen woman, and no longer desirable as a mate or a spouse. And in many cultures throughout the world, and there's still some existing today where, they can be put to death. Even just for there being suspicion that they have been unfaithful to their husbands. It's a very interesting thing for him to touch on in 16th century Italy, I would say. Don't you think?
Yeah, that's one of the surprising things about, this conversation and these kind of themes being explored, which also, show up in Shakespeare's play as well, in the conversations between Emilia and Desdemona. And so, Cinthio didn't invent this conversation. It's part of a bigger literary conversation going on, which starts to get some steam in the Renaissance, or at least the early Renaissance, questioning how the two, how genders relate to each other, how men and women relate to each other, and why there's so much injustice against women. In fact, Cinthio, one of his only other story which makes it into a Shakespeare play is the story which inspired Measure for Measure, which is about sexual exploitation of women, and even more so in Cinthio's version of that story. So, yeah, what we're seeing is that those Renaissance conversations kind of crystallized in the literature of the time. They were also, then, appearing also in Elizabethan culture and conversation. There's a book called The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, which has almost exactly the same kind of ideas we've just heard from Cinthio. And, that book was, it's cited as influencing a number of Shakespeare's plays. A copy was owned, many of Shakespeare's contemporaries owned a copy, including Ben Jonson.
Well, yeah, that's a very, very important book for its time, because it was sort of like, the nobleman's Bible, wasn't it? Sort of a how-to guide to being a noble gentleman in many ways.
Yeah, and I think that, the interesting thing for us is that, that kind of cultural innovation that was going on in these spaces, that's had such an important influence for better or for worse in modern society.
Now, you mentioned to me in our correspondence about this something about Ireland, And I've been so curious to ask you, what the heck does Ireland have to do with an Italian novella that became the source work of one of Shakespeare's Italian plays?
It is really interesting. And this is going to take us to the authorship question. And perhaps I'll explain to listeners, how I approach this. So basically, because I'm concerned with origins of these stories and how these stories move from, one culture to another, I'm diving into the sources. And generally I'm working, with the traditional theory in mind. It was written by Shakespeare. He read books, he converted them into plays. But then I also think it's important to look at it through a different lens, through an unorthodox lens, to see what that might tell us. So I use the Dennis McCarthy's work on Sir Thomas North as a kind of launching pad to investigate further. Well, if we assume for the moment that theory is correct, what does it tell us? What do we learn? So that's essentially what I did, and where it took me was to Ireland. So it turns out, we mentioned earlier that the militarization that we see in Shakespeare's version of the story isn't there in Cinthio's version. So what I was looking for is trying to find where those kind of elements were coming from. So turns out that Sir Thomas North, who was a military officer for a while, was sent to Ireland. And when he was there, he was with another fellow called Barnaby Rich. I don't know if he may have come up at some point earlier. Also a military officer and someone who was also a scholar and a writer. And these two were sent on deployments together. They clearly knew each other very well. So in the 1580s, early 1580s, we find some other sort of literary figures that pop up. Once you start looking, asking this question, these other figures start popping up, like Spencer, who was also there, Ubaldini, who was there. To come back to Rich, he wrote this book called A Farewell to the Military Profession. Not A Farewell to Arms, completely different book.
I was going to say, no, not that. That's a different book.
Yeah, they're very similar. I was wondering if
Farewell to the Military Profession.
A Farewell to the Military Profession. And the point of the title was to say that he was going to spend some time writing novellas. So this book, and you can get versions of it online, contains a series of novellas, including Rich's Apollonius and Scylla, which was some people believe it's the direct predecessor to Twelfth Night. So and this story came from Matteo Bandello, who's who was the novelist who gave us Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
So all these kind of connections are happening as I'm exploring this. So also in A Farewell to the Military Profession, there's a story which contains some of the key plot elements that are in Shakespeare's Othello, but not in Cinthio's. So a hero reaches. So these are the plot elements that seem to come from Rich's Farewell. A hero reaches Cyprus only after overcoming a fierce storm, welcomed by the governor. The threat of a Turkish attack prompts a Christian leader to prepare a response. A war leader famous for defeating the Turks is appointed to lead the expedition. After a clandestine elopement, a couple is pursued by an angry father. The father accuses his son-in-law of stealing his daughter and demands justice. There's a trial before the Duke, and the Duke sides with the son-in-law, and the daughter is summoned and exculpates her husband. This comes from the work of Thomas Cranfield, who's written about this in the secondary literature. But, that list is like a point-by-point description of Shakespeare's Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2. So, there's a connection between Rich and this play. And so how do we, how do we explain that connection? I think for the purposes of our conversation, it's just important to note that Rich is a significant figure.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is you take, the writer says, oh, there's this great Italian novella about this woman, Desdemona. And then there's this other great story over here by this guy, Barnaby Rich. And I'm going to combine them together and turn it into a stage production. Is that basically what we're looking at?
Yeah, so the main component is the Cinthio novella, but the writer, the playwright is taking, significant elements from other works and then combining it into this final product. Exactly that. There's another figure I want to mention who's also connected with Rich and with Cinthio, who's really interesting. So in this Farewell to Military Profession, there's 3 novellas which are translations of Cinthio novellas, translations into English. So these are the earliest, known translations of Cinthio's novellas into English. None of them are the plays. None of them are Othello or Measure for Measure. But, they're there in Rich's book. And Rich attributes, he says they were written by a guy called, he only gives the initials, LB. And, scholars believe that LB was a guy called Ludovico Brisket or Ludovico Briscetta, an Anglo-Italian writer and also military officer, and who later published, translations of Cinthio's Discourse on Civil Life, an essay that Cinthio had written. Once again, you're seeing, Cinthio, you see Bandello, you see this group of writers. Their paths cross in the early 1580s in Ireland. Now, this is the sort of stuff that you would want to find in, Shakespeare's personal history. That he would, that he'd been in Ireland in 1580s and was talking to these guys. But of course, we don't have that. Mm-hmm. But using the Sir Thomas North theory, it illuminates this Irish connection to the Shakespearean works. A guy called William Maley, a researcher called William Maley, did this work. I'm just summarising it and representing it in my translation.
Well, it certainly, if it does nothing else, the one thing it most specifically does to me in my mind is it eliminates the man from Stratford from being a contender in the creation of this play. Because we have, as you say, zero evidence whatsoever. First of all, we don't even have any evidence the man could actually read, but let alone read an Italian novella, get his hands on the writings of Barnaby Rich, and have these types of connections to the work. They absolutely make zero sense for, a grain hoarder and a grain dealer from Stratford to have been associated with any of this.
Yeah, I think the other thing the Othello story does is it really saying, the writer has some military experience. He's portraying the jealousies of military officers. He makes the jealousies among military officers the point of the story. In fact, there's another link to Sir Thomas North in that regard. The conversation Iago has about Cassio being a book soldier,
right?
Only a book soldier. That concept is taken from Nepo's Lives and The Dial of Princes, which are translations by Sir Thomas North. So again, there's another connection there. So, I think if we're seriously interested in kind of really understanding what was happening, these are data points that we need to think about and, work into our understanding of the era. What was really wonderful for me was discovering this circle of writers there and saying, yeah, wow, that's the kind of environment that this literature was being created in. Different writers who are all responding to this literature coming from overseas and making their own creations based on that and influencing each other.
In a sense, you almost have created, what I'm seeing in my mind is you've created this like Renaissance book club where these men, these very educated men, and who are also dabbling in writing of their own, are sharing different books with each other. Hey, have you read this Desdemona by this guy Cinthio yet? No, I haven't read that one yet. Well, here, when I'm done with it, I'll give it to you. You can read it. It's almost like it's like the book of the month club type of a thing with some of these guys. It's what you're sort of putting together here for me.
Yeah, that's the sort of image I was getting from it. And, this was how these guys, when they were on deployment were spending at least a good chunk of their spare time. This is what they got a buzz from.
Yeah, and then when you look at, well, I'm going to take this story and I'm going to tweak it a little bit and I'm going to turn it into a different story and I'm going to write it in one of my own books, and then the other guy says, oh, well, if you're going to do that, looks like you also stole a few things from my book. Oh yeah, I did. I hope you're okay with that. Yeah, I guess that's all right. You know what I mean? It seems like there's this sharing of literature and sharing of plot lines and even, sharing each other's writings to influence each other, regardless of the plays of Shakespeare, just the other things these men were creating at the time.
Yeah. And, for them, this was perfectly okay, this kind of reworking literature and bouncing off each other. It was part of the process as far as they were concerned. And part of the, it's a shame almost that Shakespeare's, he's so dominant in our cultural memory that he's put all these contemporaries into shade when they were doing really interesting stuff that is worth digging into, whether it's the people in England or the people in Italy.
But none of them were writing for the stage, though, were they? Like Barnaby Rich didn't never write a play, and Thomas North, for all we can tell, the things that were published under his name, none of them were ever a play. So these men are published writers, but they're not playwrights, right?
There's no evidence. Yeah, well, I think it's hard to find the evidence. So, I think Dennis McCarthy would try to make the case. One of the interesting things that, your comments reminded me of is that Rich in his book comments that some of the novellas that he's written, had already been turned into plays, and then he's turned them into books, into novellas. So, I think there was, different type, these two types of literatures were in conversation with each other.
And again, another layer of, sharing each other's work, or, what they say is the highest form of flattery is imitation, right? And so if you have somebody like a Barnaby Rich who sees a play, let's call it Measure for Measure, and he says, wow, that's a great play, but I need to write it in story form so people can just read the story without it having to be in script format. And while I do that, I'm going to also make some changes here, there, or the other way around, right? Like, it's possible that, as you said, if he mentions this, well, some of these have already been plays, that there is a reverse engineering going on there, right?
Yeah. Interestingly, that happens with Romeo and Juliet as well. The Arthur Brooke, I think, when he writes his epic Romeo and Juliet poem, the first English version, he mentions at the beginning of his that he's seen a play performed of that story. which was in 1562. So, very early in the piece. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. If only we had more documents to help us decrypt it all. But I guess that's part of the fun of why this topic is so fascinating, because it is a struggle to try and find evidence that might give you a new insight on a particular question.
Well, and of course, then when you look at dates like that, like 1562, that also makes it impossible from the man from Stratford to have written the Romeo and Juliet play that Arthur Brooke is talking about. It's literally impossible.
Yeah, he couldn't have written that play that Arthur Brooke mentions in 1562 because he was a baby,
right?
Or he wasn't even born. I can't even. I'm not sure of the exact date. But yeah, I guess traditional scholarship is now leaning more and more to the idea of looking for co-authors for different Shakespeare works. And so, yeah, I think the question is how much is the William Shakespeare of Stratford responsible for how much did he receive as an already completed product? And maybe the answer to that isn't necessarily the same for every play. I think it's undeniable that he was, as guests have said on your podcasts, he was an entrepreneur, impresario. He was the one who brought these plays to the stage. So he plays a very important role. But the open question is, how much did he actually write? How much did others write?
Well, and I think when you look at some of the plays, and this, tying this back to Othello and tying back to Cinthio's writing, so when Cinthio writes this novella, Desdemona, this cautionary tale, as it were, he had to know his audience. And especially at that time in history, the audience is not as broad as an audience would be today for content generators who are writing for today's audiences. It's very specific sect of society that can even read, let alone purchase a book, or interested in literature as culture. So who's he aiming at, and what message is he sending? And then when you look at the plays of Shakespeare, I think that there's so much evidence there that those plays are written yes, they are entertaining, and yes, they are meant to entertain. I'm certain of it. But I also feel like in every single one of them, there is a specific message being sent to the elites of England at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to explore, and something I spend quite a bit of time, examining in the commentary I write, and particularly I'm trying to understand, what was the status of women in Italy and England in this era? What were ideas about race, and what manifestations of racism were there in these two societies and the broader Mediterranean context? And I think it's important to do that exploration. As you've already been saying, that the societies of that era are not the same as today, even though we can recognise how we got here from those times. One thing I think is perhaps not known as well as it might is the fact that there were African people, or people of African origin, in both England and Italy, quite a number in this era. So, and one scholar makes the very insightful observation that we know the story of Othello, who's a fictional character who never went to England, but we don't know the real stories of these Black or African tutors who lived in England in that period. In fact, by 1600, there were enough people of dark complexion that, the government, Elizabeth, was issuing proclamations to exclude them from England. Similar things were happening in Spain in the same era as Othello's reaching the stage. Spain is inventing ideas such as limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, which was a way of targeting people who had previously been Muslim or Jewish, but who became Christians, new Christians. So they couldn't be persecuted because of their faith, but they were regarded with suspicion. So, this idea was created in that context by the Spanish to, exclude them from society. And eventually, they all ended up expelled, or, as best the state could, they expelled these people. So, the ideas that we would recognize today as profoundly racist were starting to take hold in that era. If we go back even in Italy, it's a bit harder to find it, but there's been a lot of work done in the English language. Less work's been done on Renaissance Italy, but it's starting to happen. And, it's very interesting, some of the insights that have been drawn. So people have used the visual arts and physical arts to explore the African presence in Italy. And you can see the evolution of images from ones where there's kind of a matter-of-fact presentation of, an ambassador or a black art patron or a black soldier, to one which is more about racial hierarchies. A white person with their shoulder with their hand on the shoulder of a black slave, as the Atlantic slave trade started to grow, Italy started to import black slaves from that trade. But of course, Italy had a long, it wasn't a country at this point, but it had its own long history of slavery that goes back to, with the involvement of the Venetians and the Genoese trading slaves across the Mediterranean, as the other shore of the Mediterranean, the Muslim shore of the Mediterranean, was doing the same thing. And even, to expand our focus even a bit further, if we look into Arabic literature, for example, of the 1001 Nights, it starts with a story of racism and misogyny. It starts with the story of a mad king who wants to kill women because his wife has cheated on him with a black slave. So there's both elements of this colour prejudice and there's elements of misogyny. But also you have the figure of Sherazade, who represents female wisdom, female courage, and ultimately healing of the madness of the king. So, there's that story. And there are other stories also from that Mediterranean context. So you see, slavery is present.
That's the Winter's Tale, isn't it? Right there, right? It's the...
I have to admit I'm not familiar with it.
Leontes kind of goes mad. He has this like jealous madness in his mind, the king, and accuses his wife, Hermione, of having an affair with his best friend, Polixenes, and the whole story unravels, right? And that's the whole thing. Mm-hmm. He even drives away his daughter because of her affiliation with her mother. And in his misogyny, he is, throwing the sins of the mother upon his own daughter as well. And, by the end, he comes to his senses and, of course, is then reunited with both wife and daughter. And it's the famous statue coming to life at the end of the play. Mm. And the interesting connection there, we won't tie this all back into one big, beautiful circle. The interesting connection there is they talk about the sculpture being as beautiful as the sculptures of Giulio Romano, the painter. And everyone always said, oh, come on. This is where Shakespeare had no clue what he was talking about, because everyone knows that that's a painter, not a sculptor. But I've seen one of the most beautiful sculptures I've ever seen, and it's over the top of the grave of Castiglione in Italy, and it was sculpted by Giulio Romano at the request of Castiglione's mother as part of the memorial to her son. And you tie all that together and you suddenly go, whoever wrote all this stuff must have stood right there, must have been right there to see all of that and be able to connect all that together, you know?
Yeah, it's such a small group of people, you know, that narrative of that connection who are doing this and have had such a huge influence on us.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, though, I do feel that I've always had a sense from the play, and I've seen, you know, paintings, and I've seen old photographs of actors who have played the role of Othello and have played him more Arab than African. And there is some reference in the play that lends itself to that. Many have speculated that Othello is really Moroccan, perhaps. And we do see a character in The Merchant of Venice, that is the Moroccan prince, a black-skinned prince who comes to be a suitor to Portia in that play. Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, there's very little reference there to his history, like where he may come from. I know Othello the Moor is very clear that he's called the Moor, but he also makes references that make you feel like it's not of African descent, especially when, and I get it, I know that Egypt is obviously on the continent of Africa, but he does mention the whole thing about the handkerchief, and he says that handkerchief was given to my mother by an Egyptian. That would definitely be very northern Africa, and not necessarily the type of African that we now in modern context consider Othello to be.
Yeah, it's a question that's you see debated in the literature about who exactly Othello was, what his background was. Moro, the Italian word in Cinthio, the word itself means someone from North Africa, so African in that sense, usually of Muslim background. But also Cinthio's story, uses black when describing, when Iago wants to attack Othello, he says to him, Desdemona is tiring of your blackness. It's I guess at the end of the day, it's impossible really to know. Clearly they're perceived, these characters are perceived as outsiders, as different. That's an issue in Cinthio's story. Desdemona's family are not happy. She's together with with Othello, although she's blissfully happy. In the play, of course, you have Brabantio and all his carryings on, all the racial epithets he uses, Iago's racial epithets. There's a lot of literature around the racial elements in the story. Virginia Vaughan, for example, and its complexities. Virginia Vaughan, for example, writes, I think this play is racist and I think it's not. And Michael Neal takes that idea and then he kind of unfolds it a bit about it to just kind of remind us we're talking about a different time. So this is Michael Neal. To talk about race in Othello is to fall into anachronism. Yet not to talk about it is to ignore something fundamental about a play that has rightly come to be identified as a foundational text in the emergence of modern European racial consciousness, a play that trades in constructions of human difference, at once misleadingly like and confusingly unlike those 20th century notions to which they are nevertheless recognizably ancestral. So, yeah, I guess Neil is saying, it may be a bit different to what we see in society today, but you can see where it came from when you go to these texts. You can see these racial ideas being represented in the characters and debated in the discourse in the play.
Well, we find throughout the canon, I mean, when you look at the plays of Shakespeare through that lens, you can find plenty of references throughout the canon where cultural differences are mocked and stereotyped and made fun of throughout the plays. Not just Shylock the Jew and Othello the Moor, but there are references and there are characters who are mocked. They're French doctors. The Welsh are the butt of many jokes in Shakespeare's plays. There are characters who literally mention, we're talking 450 years of people saying, don't trust an Irishman with your liquor. Mm-hmm. These are very established stereotypes that we are used to having seen, but it makes you wonder, how established were they at that time? Or is Shakespeare documenting them? Is he creating them when he has these characters mock other characters from different countries, regardless of their skin color?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting context. It's a really interesting context to bring out, and another point of difference between Cinthio and Shakespeare. So, there just isn't a lot about race in Cinthio. It's there, but it's like the minor note, and this particular story is about it. But Cinthio in general seems much more interested, across his stories in women and men and their relationships. That's not to say that in Italian literature there weren't, these kind of racist portrayals, particularly, as far as Moors were concerned. But yeah, the Irish, is an example of, is interesting also, in the connection of the Irish circle we were talking about. But one thing I think is hard not to conclude is that this playwright, this writer, was intensely interested in questions of race. And it's, that it keeps coming up again and again in his works. So, and I think in part he's definitely representing things he's seen, like the kind of carrying, Iago's language. The writer has seen someone say that. I think that's almost certain. But yeah, it's very, and I think, it's also telling us something about the society of the time, which was becoming increasingly racialized in this era. So, and, it's connected with also the rise of England as a colonial power. So, the fact that they were attacking Ireland is connected with how they represent the Irish. And then as the English, spread out, those sort of ideas become part of the imperial toolbox.
Yeah, and of course, in Europe at that time, there's so much rivalry among the nations as well. I mean, so when you talk about, you even have, like, when we talked about Romeo and Juliet, you even have Mercutio, who makes references to the Spanish with, derogatory comments about your Spanish slops and that type of thing, about their fashion, what the way they dress. And it's interesting because then you look at the context of fashion at the time and them wanting to have the latest trends from France and from Italy. But if you wore them too much or you wore them incorrectly or whatever, now suddenly you're foppish, you're the Italianate Earl, and so it's this really interesting dichotomy of cultures clashing together and yet being, I don't know, military rivals to much of a degree, I guess, is a big part of it. Of course, then there's religious rivals, of course, at that time becomes very prevalent, thanks to Elizabeth's father, most primarily. So yeah, I think it's interesting that you tell us Cinthio per se wasn't writing a racial novella. He just used the character of the Moor as a mechanism to more clearly demonstrate the true theme of his story, which is this jilted lover, misogynistic, evil guy who wants to destroy the object of his lust because he can't have her. It's interesting because then you talk about Cinthio's other novella that has become a Shakespeare play, Measure for Measure, and you have Angelo, who basically is a very similar character as an Iago, isn't he? When he goes, I want to have this woman, Isabella, but she's a nun and I'm not allowed to have her. So I will find this leverage over her to force her to be with me and threaten that if she doesn't, I'll kill her brother, right? In that play. So It's a very interesting connection there too, that obviously our author found and expounded upon after obviously reading Cinthio's works.
Yeah, so clearly that's also a theme of interest to Shakespeare, those kind of elements that you were describing came from Cinthio's novella. Cinthio, it might be interesting actually to talk a little bit about Cinthio, who he was, where he came from, that sort of thing.
Tell me what I don't know, because there's a lot I don't know.
Yeah, and this is just an outline, and I'm by no means an expert on his life or anything like that. But he really interesting character. Lived from 1504 to 1573 in Ferrara most of his life. Ferrara was, one of the independent city-states in the Po Valley, not far from Venice. So when he's talking about Venice, he's talking about a place he knows, though he doesn't say very much about it in Othello, actually. But Cinthio was a dramatist as well as a writer. So he wrote these 100 books, but he was also he experimented with drama. And in his era, the popular thing to do was to put on ancient Roman and Greek plays. And he was the first dramatist to really break out of this and start writing his own original plays. So he writes this play called Orbeke, which was basically he takes Senecan plays and he creates a Senecan play on steroids. He puts all the murder, the blood and everything, and puts it in Orbeke. So those kind of plays, that kind of stuff is thought about as an indirect inspiration of Titus Andronicus, which is a similar sort of thing.
Sure.
Cinthio worked as secretary to the Duke of Ferrara, and Ferrara was famous as a place where people would stage plays. So, so this was one of the places in Italy where English travellers were coming and being exposed to these ideas, these stories. They'd come to the castle there in Ferrara, and there would be a play in the courtyard, or maybe out on a country estate somewhere outside the city. It's very, very interesting background. He's quite an influential character. He wrote stories. He wrote essays about writing poetry and about writing drama as well, which were translated as well into English. Like others of this era, he's very little known, including in Italy. So very few people sort of know him. In fact, I don't think or I haven't found at least any English translation of his 112 stories. So it's never been fully translated into English as far as I'm aware.
Do we know anything about the origin of the pen name? Like, why does he choose Cinthio? What does it have any special meaning? Where does it come from? Do we know anything about that?
Not that comes to mind. I think I read it somewhere, but I've forgotten what it was. There was some particular reason he chose it. But yeah, I can't remember.
What does it mean? Does it have an Italian word origin? The word Cinthio, the name?
Yeah, that's what I can't bring to mind. So yeah, in Italian, it's Cinthio, which is a name. There's also an Italian version, a female version, Cinzia. So I have a cousin called Cinzia. But yeah, it
as
does
in
have
like the number 5, like Cinque? Like,
no, I think it might be Greek. But yeah, don't quote me because I've really forgotten.
Well, I mean, it was, if you trace back the history, you go back to Roman times, and look how often the Romans named their children by the order they came out. There's still to this day, there are plenty of firstborn males in that part of the world who have the name Primo or Primus, right? There's most of the children of in Titus Andronicus, Titus has multiple sons, and some of them are basically named after the number that they are in order of birth.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if Cinthio, is that what you say? Cinthio?
Yeah, I don't think so, because he chose it as a pen name. That's what I recall at the moment. And there was some meaning that he was particularly wanting in choosing that pen name. But yeah, apologies, I can't.
But it's not connected to the number 5.
Yeah, I don't think so.
He's the fifth-born son or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Something actually interesting to mention, and this is something that brings out how Shakespeare can dramatize with such interesting effect. We've already talked about how he brings Iago right up front, and his plotting right up front. So a much more dramatic beginning, but also the character Rodrigo doesn't exist in the Cinthio novel. And Rodrigo seems to be a kind of splitting of Iago into two different characters. So Rodrigo gets Iago's lusts, and he ends up doing the things that, some of the things that Iago does in Cinthio's novella, like attack Cassio. And then, Iago has this other role. So, and by splitting Iago into two characters, he can put them on stage talking to each other. So I thought that was really great. But yeah, it reminds me a bit of Gollum.
Well, it also makes Iago even more wicked because of the way he uses Rodrigo and then destroys him once he's done with him, So it demonstrates another layer of the evilness of the character to have this sort of pawn that he's been playing and using. Thus do I make my fool my purse, kind of thing. He tells us, he turns right to us and says, I'm just taking him for his money. And as soon as I'm done using him, I will be rid of him. And then he does, he kills him. And I think just adds to another layer of Iago that we as the audience want to like boo and hiss at him from the stage,
Yeah. I think the portrayal is one of the, just such a terrifying portrayal, really. And when it's acted very well, it's such a powerful character, a powerfully malevolent character.
Well, and Shakespeare has him, he's very much one of, I think, Shakespeare's big experiments with the anti-hero in a lot of ways, because he has him do things that would normally endear us to a character in a play. Things like sometimes simple things, but he, for instance, talks right to us. Generally, characters that talk to us, we like more, right? As an audience. He shares with us his inner thoughts, right? So now we should feel more connected to that character than we would feel to Othello, for instance. He sings and is well liked in the party atmosphere, in the tavern scene where he's singing with the other soldiers. He removes his shirt in one scene to take off his shirt and help wrap Cassio's wound, right? And so now you've got the shirtless hero moment of Iago. There's a lot of things there that Shakespeare does that I think he's playing with us. He's like, I'm tempting you to like this guy. And for what reason? You have to wonder if it truly is about the focus on trying to bring attention to the racism aspect of the story, and possibly even trying to poke certain people in the eye with this commentary. Like, shame on you elites, you nobles of England, because this is you. You behave this way. You have these feelings, these thoughts, and look what it can cause. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are elements of that. It's you can't lie. Yeah, I think despite the kind of things that you've described, where a viewer might be tempted to connect with Iago. He's such he's doing such terrible things, and he's so wicked that there's just no way that you can overlook his malevolence and evil. So what I take away from it at a minimum is that he's drawing this pen character. He's presenting this character. This is a racist. This is what a racist can be. And he's seen something like that, and it's very ugly. And he presents that to his audience. And I think he intentionally does that. But there are also, I think people were trying to work out how people of different cultures related to each other. And philosophically, like if you look at the speech that Othello gives at the end of, just before he takes his own life, it's both misogynist and racist. He talks about how he's going to kill the turbaned Turk or something that like that, who he once met in Aleppo. And what I took from that was that the Venetian part was killing the Moorish part, and that the Moorish part was responsible for Othello's actions. So yeah, that's, I don't know how you can explain that without thinking the writer is reaching these kind of conclusions that people are different because of their cultural or background or racial background.
Well, and it's that famous line. He said, I took the uncircumcised dog by the throat and smote him thus. And then he stabs himself.
Yeah, you do it much better than I did. my very poor version.
And the thing I always talk about with Othello particularly is, and I feel like there's this extra contextual layer that Shakespeare places in the canon, this character, because out of all of the 37 plays, Othello is the most eloquent speaker. He has some of the most beautiful language, and the way that he describes things and the way he shares in the opening scenes about how Desdemona came to love him through him telling his story. And we sit and listen and we go, well, yeah, I'd fall in love with you too. You speak so beautifully, and wow, what an incredible, mysterious guy you are, and these fabulous stories that you have and the life you have lived is part of the game, isn't it? It's part of the author's intent. One of the things that I do find difficult about the play is, whenever I've been involved with the production of it, especially when I've directed it and had an actor playing that role, it's super, super important. They must be loved immediately. You can't foreshadow what's going to happen. Everyone already knows what's going to happen, but we need to love him the way Desdemona loves him in those opening acts of the play, or by the end of the play, we will definitely condemn him. He definitely will become what Iago says he is if we're not careful with the way we see him and accept him in the beginning acts of the play. I find is part of the difficulty of that play.
Yeah, I think this raises the question of the representation of the play, which is such an important element in the play's effect. So, with consciousness to those kinds of questions, Othello can be presented in a way which doesn't result in a racist message being conveyed to the audience. In fact, they come away with an anti-racist conclusion. But, in the past, maybe some of the representations were completely the opposite. They were wanting to tell the story about it. Wanting to tell a story about this terrible Moor and what he did to this beautiful Venetian woman, sort of thing.
Oh, I'm sure in the Victorian era and during even the pre-Victorian era, the era of like David Garrick and those guys who were basically rewriting Shakespeare plays all the time for their own means and purposes for their own productions. I'm sure you had, foot stomping Othello, right? Who was angry and yelled and full of rage all the time, right? Yeah, I could see that. It's definitely has to be the case. And of course, always you had white actors in blackface playing the role too. So, I mean, there was that always happening, One of the most famous Othellos was Edwin Booth, the older brother of John Wilkes Booth, the famous assassin. A lot of people don't know that the Booth brothers were some of the greatest actors of their age during that very controversial time.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and in some ways, I didn't want to write about Othello because it has all these distressing elements, but in another way, it's kind of, I think, important to engage with it and to learn from it. It tells us so much about the journey we've been on as a society, and it's part of, I think, you were kind of alluding to this earlier, Othello being a kind of both a vehicle of racial tropes, but also, in a way, a tool that can allow us to discuss, the problems of racism, problems of misogyny in our society, problems of domestic violence. So I think in those senses, it's a really important story, whether in the Italian version or in the play, in the Shakespeare play.
Well, it's a fascinating history, and the connections that are there are also extremely fascinating. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to have this discussion about it. And I want to make sure that our listeners know, I'm assuming we can find the book on Amazon.
Yep, that's right. It's called Cinthio's Desdemona, the story that inspired Othello. And, it should come up in a search on Amazon or on Google. If you add my name, Michael Curtotti, I'm sure you'll find it. Thank you, Stephen, for this conversation. It's just we've explored so many dimensions, and it's so wonderful speaking to you about it. And with all your knowledge of the presentation of Shakespeare as drama, and your work with Don't Quill the Messenger. It's such a wonderful show, and thank you again.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate your kind words. Everybody, it's spelled Curtotti. That's how you spell Michael's last name, Michael Curtotti. Curtotti. Look him up on Amazon. You'll find his other book that we discussed on a previous episode about a year or so ago. And now you can find this new one. As he mentioned, it's Cinthio's Desdemona, the story that inspired Othello, and sure to be of great interest to all of you when you look at how important the source elements are to the works of Shakespeare. And this has been a delightful and very enlightening conversation, Michael. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping that this means Measure for Measure is coming next.
I've been thinking about the next one, and I'm thinking maybe some time for something lighter. I really like Bandello's Twelfth Night. His version is a beautiful version of the story, lots of fun. So that might be my next project.
Okay. Well, those are both, Measure for Measure is one of those ones they call a problem play, because it does have some real dark elements in it, obviously. Yeah.
But that's on the list as well. I want to do Measure for Measure down the track, but it seems to take about a year to get through this process. So hopefully next year I can produce another one if all goes well.
Well, thank you so much. I really, again, appreciate you joining us from all the way across the planet. You're the one. I've had another guest who lives in New Zealand, but between the two of you, you definitely win the award for farthest distance from me when it comes to guests of this program. But we always love to have our international guests join us from wherever they are in the world. And Michael, thank you so much for sharing all this information about Cinthio's Desdemona.
Thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, fellow Quillers. Just another fantastic episode that helps to prove, at the very minimum, that the Stratford man is the absolute worst candidate for the author known as Shakespeare. It doesn't matter to me who or what you believe in, as long as you come to your senses about the fallacy of the Stratford straw man. Then we can at least agree on that point and get down to the real mystery. Hey, listen, just a few items to throw your way before we wrap up. Don't forget, you can join our email subscriber list right from the homepage of our website. I send out an email only about once per month or so, and we do not ever share our list with anyone. But it's a great way to make sure you stay up to speed on what is going on with all things Quiller in nature. You can also follow our Facebook and Instagram pages to stay informed and help spread the word to others by building our followers. So if you haven't visited either of those, and at least just click the follow button, we would appreciate if you do that and help us grow our platforms. Of course, ratings and reviews at your favorite streaming service are a big boost to us across the various podcast platforms, so please be sure to do that as well. And if you haven't visited our Patreon page to take a look at how you can further support the show, please click on over there and explore the various levels of support that are available. You can find that very easily by going to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger, or just go to don'tquillthepodcast.com, our website, and click on the red Patreon box right there on the homepage. It'll take you straight to the Patreon page, and you can kind of explore around and see what we have to offer there. Take a look at the growing bonus feature library. There is at least another 100 hours of content available there for you just by becoming a serial quiller through the Patreon page. and new content is added almost every month. The latest bonus is part 1 of my 2-part series, taking apart editor Stephen Orgel's latest publication about the book of the play in the age of Shakespeare. But there are also watch-along movie episodes on specific films, special episodes about specific works of the Shakespeare canon, my very popular 2-part series about the death of Edward de Vere, and so much more in the library, the bonus feature library that is only available to Patreon patrons at the serial quiller level or above. For the meager price of a couple of Starbucks lattes per month, you can have access to that growing library of special content and know that you are also helping to keep this series going now into its 7th season. Thank you all for sharing this mysterious journey with us. We are indeed grateful to have you all as fellow quillers in this growing quiller nation. By my account, the largest continuous audience of Shakespeare authorship mystery super sleuths in the entire world and perhaps throughout all of history. Let's keep growing. Let's keep sharing. And let's keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.